Welcome. Welcome to the Law, Your Money, and You. I'm Roberta Saphire, an attorney in Sharon, Massachusetts. And
I'm Camille Barron, a financial organizer and healthcare advisor, also in Sharon, Massachusetts. And we are here back again with one of our favorite guests who has been with us since the very beginning. Go ahead, Roberta, and introduce.
Yeah, and it's 11 years. And considering she was only 18 at the time, and we were 22. Anyway, Emily Smith Lee. There's so much to her. I don't know where to start, but except we will start that she's presently a select woman, select person. Is that what they call it? Emily, say hi to our viewers and tell us a little bit about yourself, and don't leave out your kids either.
Okay, very good. Hi, good to see you both. So I'm an attorney practicing in Sharon. My law firm is SLM Law. We've been in Sharon for about, you're right, Roberta, it's 11 years. Wow.
Yeah, but before that, you've been practicing way longer than 11 years.
I've been practicing for 25 years. I previously worked for a Boston law firm. And I don't know, honestly, if I'm a select woman, a select person, or a member of the select board. It's one of those three. And prior to that, I served on school committee in the town of Sharon. And you said not to leave out my kids. My daughter Caroline is 25 and studying to be a teacher, and my son Clint is 21 and is a musician.
Right. And you know what's interesting? A few years ago, your daughter was in college, and your son was playing with a local band, and he was fantastic.
Well,
and he
thank you.
Still is fantastic. But it's interesting, and you. I don't want to leave it out, but you are not only a lawyer, but you graduated summa cum laude. Did I say that right?
There were some letters and Latin words.
Yeah, some letters and Latins, and you practice a lot in Boston against big city, whether it's a big city attorney or a little small town issue of street, you're there. But anyway, so let's do a little bit. You grew up though in a small town. We just want to get, people know that you go visit your mother here and there in a small town, Chester, Mass. Tell us a little bit about, does any of that give you lessons in how to deal with Sharon, which is like a big city compared to it?
Yeah, right. I know I'm on my practice. So we've operated a satellite office out in Chester for a little over a year. So I'm out there on Fridays and Sharon the rest of the week. Yeah, it does make Sharon look like a big city. The town of Chester's population is about 1,100, I think. Okay. But it's part of a collection of towns called the Hill Towns. If you sort of imagine a triangle between Springfield, Northampton, and Pittsfield, they're right there, sort of in the middle. And it's, one of the interesting things about some of these rural communities is that they really have very few services locally available to them. There are no other attorneys in this 23 town basin at all. But, people there have the same legal needs as everybody else. So it's been really kind of fun and interesting sort of learning about that aspect. But they're really the same problems that we handle here in Sharon.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Camille, you told me you wanted to ask her about the difference in COVID.
Yeah, so we've talked with you, Emily, both on the show and off the show about some of the implications of the COVID pandemic in terms of the law. And now that we're over a year past when it first hit, can you tell us any trends that you've observed in the law that are here because of COVID? Have things changed, whether they're for the good, the bad, or the indifferent, in terms of either legal cases that are brought up or how they may be settled?
Yep. No, it's a great question. I mean, one of the things that happened very early in the pandemic was the Supreme Judicial Court kind of pushed a major pause button on all litigation. So all statutes of limitations were told, and all case deadlines were told. you know, that probably was a good idea to keep people from exposing each other to the disease. It has created an enormous backlog in civil litigation in particular, because as things start to open up, understandably, the highest priorities for the courts are the criminal cases. So a lot of the civil, I mean, I'm having cases scheduled for trial in 2022 at this point. So
Really?
that's, and, you know, in some cases, it encourages settlement because that's an awfully long time for parties to wait to get adjudicated.
What kind of cases? Let the people know, what kind of cases, these statute of limitations and all that?
So everything was suspended. So if you were going to run out of time to file a lawsuit on March 18th of 2020, you actually didn't run out of time until July 2nd, which was one day after the stay was lifted. Similarly, if you were in the middle of a case and you had a deadline to do something on March 18th, you didn't have to do it till July 2nd. So, you know, in a lot of ways that gave everybody a little breathing room, which was fantastic. It's been
Could they still file, excuse me, could they still file pleadings? Like, you know, you used to hear them say they will plead them to death, you know. What about limitations or deadline?
So that's the thing. You could still file in a case. So if we had an active case, we could still file a discovery request, for example, but nobody had to do anything about it till after July 1. So we could file it or serve it, but they didn't have to answer us. So
there were also a lot of cases, or we know that certain things like, say, landlord-tenant issues where somebody didn't pay their rent, or evictions, there was a hold put on that, or given an extension of time in which you could pay. How are those things going now?
So we don't do a lot in the landlord-tenant, but absolutely, there was a foreclosure and eviction moratorium in Massachusetts that lasted until sometime in October. And then there's the commercial moratorium went away completely at that point for tenants with commercial leases. There was a federal moratorium for residential tenants that lasted a little bit longer. Yeah, I mean, that moratorium didn't really excuse anybody from paying rent, but you couldn't start proceedings to kick people out. So as a practical matter, I think I've read this is outside my practice area, but you know, a lot of people who were tenants got into a pretty deep financial hole during that period, and a lot of people who were landlords were struggling as well.
I would think
the
the landlord
moratorium still in place, or has it expired?
The Massachusetts one expired in October. I don't actually know about the federal one because, like I said, we don't do a lot of landlord tenant stuff.
There was a recent case though, just for commercial, somebody on I think it was Newberry Street, on one of those streets, where the restaurant got away. The court found that they didn't have to pay. Now I don't know if it's on appeal or not, but that seems crazy. I mean, because a lot of people, the poor landlord, it might be their only means of income, and so now they're out.
So I'd be interested to read that case. I wonder whether, because there was a lot of arguing sort of mid-pandemic about whether the force majeure clauses in people's contracts and leases apply to a pandemic, right? Because some contracts have that provision that says, you know, act of God, terrorism, etc. We don't have to comply. Some, but not all of those were capable of encompassing the pandemic. So I don't know that case, but that might have been what happened there.
Well, I know the insurance companies won't cover loss from loss of business clause there, unless it's damage to the building. And I thought the state was talking about putting a law through that they had to, but nothing's happened on that, I can tell you that. And the restaurant associations are having meetings about that, not restaurants not paying rent. But it's funny, you hear all this, you know, talk and shout and everything, but it doesn't mean anything. The only one who talks and shouts and does anything is Emily.
I try not to shout. I try not to shout.
No,
But
well,
other,
you're good though. How do you manage to do everything?
not sure.
But you know who we left out too on your background, which we'll get back to? Your husband.
Yes.
Wasn't he doing a podcast or something? He was helping us with our getting the
uh,
podcast.
Well, his actual job is he works for the Department of Education, but he's been exploring podcasting and other forms of broadcasting during that's become one of his pandemic hobbies.
Do you look upon him for advice of anything, or does he look upon you for advice?
Depends on what the issue is, right? It depends on what the issue is.
You know, Emily, we know that even though you say you're not an expert in certain types of law, like landlord-tenant, we know that you are an expert in employment law.
Oh, yeah.
So what about the, now that we're in the stage we're at and people are getting vaccinated,
Yep.
companies are deciding whether or not they should have their employees return to the office. What is going to happen with that? There may be employees, for instance, who don't feel comfortable returning to the office. And what are the rights and responsibilities of both the employee and the employer in that regard?
Oh, another great question.
Oh, it is a great question. So it's been interesting watching it even pre-vaccine, because some businesses did at least partially reopen over the summer. I don't know that anybody has gone back to full 100% because the state guidance still has occupancy restrictions. It's a gray area. If you have a medical condition and you're the employee and that medical condition puts you at a higher risk of complications, you arguably could ask to continue working remotely as some form of disability accommodation. What's trickier is, and true for a lot of folks, is they themselves do not have a medical condition, but somebody in their family does. The law doesn't really account for that. So, it is, other than following the state guidance on reopening and the restrictions that the governor has imposed, an employer doesn't have to let you continue to work remotely unless they've got some obligation under the disability laws to
Can the employer insist that they, like you say, well, I got my vaccinations and so I'm fine, and in fact, I even got antibodies. Can an employer ask to see that as part of the hiring process or continue?
I mean, this is an evolving area. I think an employer can require certain safety precautions, but it would be unlikely to me that an employer could say necessarily, everybody has to get vaccinated in order to work for me. Now, it may be that they could have different rules about who works where, that if people didn't want to get vaccinated or get negative tests, possibly an employer could require those folks to work remotely. But that's, they're not going to be able to be as heavy-handed as maybe some would like to be in terms of that. But they can still require masks and distancing and hand washing and all of the things, right? Supposed to do.
There's a number of states, not where we are so much, but there's other states where masks are not required anymore.
Yep.
And I wonder how that same example would work in a state where masks are not required and the employer is maybe not able to enforce a rule, but would like the employees to wear them, and people might refuse.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, obviously not knowing all the other laws of the other states, but I would say, an employer can enforce a dress code. So an employer is going to be able to enforce a mask. Sorry, Roberta.
That's interesting that they can enforce a dress code even in today's world, because the way some people dress, which is not in my, like, oh my God, is nothing for the millenniums, if you want to say, like, huh?
And I would say then, Camille, the other big issue that's happening in employment law is for people who have collected unemployment. It was such a zoo in the spring of 2020 that people were either not getting their cases processed and their benefits for a long time, or they were getting benefits that, maybe the Department of Unemployment didn't stop and consider eligibility very carefully. So there's a lot of people right now being hit with overpayment notices.
Oh,
from
really?
Yeah. And a lot of people too who are applying now are told, well, we can't do anything because we're so overrun with phony cases. We have to straighten that out. It'll be a few weeks.
Yeah.
So,
So that's an issue. And what people ought to know about that, if they're getting on overpayment notices, is you can apply for a waiver of the overpayment
oh,
if the information that you provided in the first place was accurate.
Oh,
So
really?
if it was their mistake to call you eligible in the first place, you can
Oh,
act against that
interesting.
overpayment. And we're starting to see a lot more of those calls in the
No
last
kidding.
or so.
Really? Well, I remember way back, when you were first on our show, you revealed an actual rule that protected people from being thrown out of their houses due to foreclosure. I'll never forget that episode. I think that might have been your first,
I think it was.
where people were getting foreclosed. This was back in
oh, I
the
remember that.
recession in 2008, 2009, and people were getting foreclosure notices. And if it weren't for Emily, I think we even had a viewer, Roberta, who wrote to us and said, if it weren't for that, I wouldn't have been able to stay in my house.
Actually, it was a few of the other cable stations, because we send out to other cable stations. And one of them called me and said, because it was called Foreclosure 1, and then she says, when is Foreclosure 2 coming out? We can't wait to watch it. We got a whole group. I go, really? I'll let her know. But they were always watching for Emily.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's the same, it's really kind of a parallel situation, because people may be getting these overpayment notices and they're probably going, oh no, what am I supposed to do now? And I didn't realize until you just said it, that if they provided accurate information in the first place, they don't have to do anything. They don't have to comply with that
But you know
request.
something today, like the banks are supposed to, especially in these days, the banks are supposed to look out for their community that they're in. And I know of cases where the banks are just hitting their borrowers with extra fees and extra attorney's fees and extra this fee and extra that fee. And I know of other cases where the bank is getting sued for unfair and deceptive practice act, which is, Chapter 93A. Not all states have that act. We have it here. They call it, it's a more form of misrepresentation. But if you run into anything like that because of COVID, they're supposed to help the businesses, like the landlord that didn't get paid from his commercial tenant. I'm wondering if he has a mortgage, what about the bank? What if he can't pay? I mean, those rents too are probably $10,000-15,000 a month.
So I know here in Massachusetts, there was some legislation during COVID about mortgage banks' obligations to try to engage in good faith discussions with borrowers about modifications if they got behind. That was what was happening back in 08 and 09 and 10. The last economic crisis, there was all this, there were requirements to modify mortgages, but they were being messed up more often than they were being properly processed. I think for a silver lining of having, 2 economic crises in a decade is that the banks seem to have a better handle on that this time around. At least we're not hearing the same.
If you notice too now too, and I don't know if it's because of COVID or just because of the times. First of all, your interest rates are very low, but banks are merging. Mm-hmm. Not little teeny banks, but
Right.
Medium or big banks. They're merging under a new name, and then you're going, huh?
Right. No, it's happening all over the place. So I guess, Camille, back to your question about what's changed in legal practice. I think one really huge thing that's changed, and for the better, is that everybody's gotten used to this environment. So, pre-COVID, if I had to go into court for a client, I might be going all the way into Boston, paying to park my car, walking into the courthouse to have a 10-minute conversation with the judge. And either I'm eating 3 hours of time or I'm billing my client for 3 hours of time.
Yeah.
Either way,
Mm.
there are absolutely times when being in person in court is the right thing to do, but there's a lot of business in the civil litigation world.
How about the waiting time while you wait?
Or if you're waiting, so most of the hearings I've had on Zoom, so it used to be, I think what you're referring to, Roberta, is in most civil courtrooms, you'll get a notice saying you have a hearing at 2, and you'll show up at 2 with a dozen other people who have a hearing at 2, and you sit there and wait until it's your turn, right? On Zoom, we've
At
had
the doctor's office.
Yeah, that too.
No, I'm just kidding.
with Zoom, for the most part, each person has had their designated time, so there's almost no wait time. And honestly, even if there were, you're on Zoom and turn your screen off and do work while you wait. So I think that's gonna really, if we can hang on to that in the future, our judicial system, that's gonna really benefit clients, because it makes it more efficient. And if it's more efficient, it's less expensive. So,
Yeah. Mhm.
I'm hoping we don't let go of that.
Yeah, I think we all do.
Yes.
Yeah, that's pretty good, that part of it. Just Zooming. And then you can be anywhere in the world in Zoom.
Yeah.
Like
Well,
we've had people on from Brazil,
Yeah.
Mhm.
and I've been in Arizona. I mean, people don't even know
Right.
where you are, as long as you can do it. What about now where they do notaries, closings? They changed that too.
Yeah, actually, you're a mind reader. I was about to bring that up. So in April, we had the Emergency Virtual Notarization Act, or some version of those words, was passed. And it's on the books right now. It's set to expire some number of days after the state of emergency ends, whenever that might be. I'm hoping that they rethink it, because it's been really helpful, even regardless of COVID, for particularly our older or housebound estate planning clients to be able to do the notarization, do the witnessing as needed from anywhere. I mean, you have to be in Massachusetts, and the notary has to be an attorney or a paralegal supervised by an attorney. And there's a bunch of requirements. You have to record it, and you have to say certain things, and you have to do all these affidavits. But from the person who signs the documents perspective, it's super easy.
I didn't know you had to be an attorney to notarize somebody's
In person,
document. Yeah.
in regular times, no. Like if you were to physically be watching somebody sign a document and notarize it, you don't have to be an attorney. But on the permission to do it virtually, they made a requirement that the notary be either an attorney or a paralegal supervised by an attorney. And I think there's a lot of things in that law just to make sure that this didn't get abused. But the funny thing is, we've done these signings year after year in person. Because we have to record the virtual signing, it's actually a far better record of clients with, that somebody was competent, that they signed, that they knew what they were signing. It's a far better record than the old-fashioned way of doing things.
Mhm.
I would say so. Let's see, what else did we want to go over? Do you get crazy calls about streets and things like that?
About what?
Crazy calls. Yeah,
Oh.
do you still get, because now that you're doing the select board as opposed to the school committee, you probably, I know before you got calls about the school,
Yeah.
select board. Years ago, I worked for city council. We used to get calls about streets.
Yes, there's that. from probably more emails than calls, but
Oh, that's good, the emails. We got a lot of emails too. That's why we asked her back. Really simply.
I mean,
Camille,
on COVID impact, that's the other thing I will say from a public office perspective. We've been doing our meetings, the select board's been doing our meetings on Zoom, all the boards and committees in town as everywhere else. And
a lot of the boards are not in. I noticed that different towns, they might be in and they may not be in. Like you call up, I had a call to a different state even, and they said, well, she's comes in once a week. You get her here. That was Colorado. I mean, every state is going through this, not just us. But
Oh, yeah.
I will say one thing, just watching, observing not only my board, but other boards and committees in town. Another silver lining is that public participation has gone way, way up in these meetings because
they're home. Public. I wonder with the public safety and. You know, I know them, but I was in I've been in the last week in Arizona, in California, in Boston, and it seems that there's much more traffic on the road. It's like people you don't even know it's COVID. The airplane was stacked, except they let you get up, which was not good for my back. But very interesting. The everything seems to be back, except it's not back.
Except it's not back and it's not gone yet.
Yeah, but more and more people are getting vaccinated. So they think that once it's vaccinated, everybody's vaccinated, then what do they call it, herd immunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have my first shot tomorrow.
Oh, good. Very good.
What's
3:42, my first shot. I have an appointment to go get
You know
my.
something, I had the second shot before we got the first shots here. Arizona was way ahead, I hate to say it, but it seems like they're all caught up now in Massachusetts.
There's still a lot of people.
That's another topic for another time of people that aren't getting the shots because they don't want it, and that's why. Camille,
We are just about running out of time.
yeah, you better wrap up now. We gotta wrap up.
Yeah. I
Emily,
tell you,
thank
every
you.
time Emily is on, I learn something new, Roberta.
Yeah,
Now, I didn't file for unemployment, but if I had, and I got one of those letters, now I know what my rights are. And that's one of the things I always like about having Emily, among other things, about having her on the show. Emily, thank you very much again for joining us today.
we'll be back after the COVID.
Yes, and to our viewers, thank you for watching. If you have any questions, let us know. If you have any ideas or suggestions for future topics, let us know that too. Because remember, this is your show, the law, your money, and you.
And you. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
That was interesting. I really